All right, so the claim that behaviorists are making by the turn of the 20th century is that psychology is now in a position to be a mature, independent science. They'll argue that two things had to happen, given the complexity of the subject matter. Human beings are extraordinarily complex. Two things had to happen before psychology could be in a position to launch a scientific enterprise with the human psyche as a subject matter. They'll argue that there are very good reasons why psychology is relatively a latecomer on the scientific scene, and that psychology has to build on the achievements of the earlier sciences. And there are two important achievements that had to be accomplished here. One is a content thesis. What they will argue is that psychology could not happen or could not come into existence as a science if it had not been for the development of evolutionary biology in the 19th century. That what evolution does is enables us intellectually to sever the connections to that pre-scientific, traditional, and in often cases religious way of thinking about the human psyche in terms of a soul or in terms of an immaterial spirit. As long as we have even a whiff of thinking of the human psyche as partly constituted by or driven by a soul or a spirit, that's some sort of spooky, immaterial something or other, we're never going to have a science. We're not even going to try to have a science because by definition, a soul or a spirit like that is not going to be amenable to a scientific investigation. So the breakthrough that evolution provides is not to give an account of a biological history and a theoretical account of how particular species came into existence, but it provides that needed psychological break with dualism. Because what evolution does is it makes human beings continuous with all of the other natural organisms that exist right on the earth. Evolution says that what we have is relatively simple organic phenomenon given enough time, developing increasingly complex biological capacities and then rudimentary psychological capacities, organisms that can sense their environments and respond to their environments. And then those physical and psychological capacities develop in increasing complexity over unimaginably long stretches of time, until we get beings like dogs and dolphins and chimpanzees and the other primates who are capable of fairly sophisticated psychological activities. And then finally, evolution goes to the point where we get the human psyche, which is another order of complexity greater than many of the other primates. But the idea then is that we don't have the view that somehow human beings and the human psyche is metaphysically special, that in some sense we've got this very complicated physical organism, but a god added this spooky spiritual stuff to the mix, and that's what makes us what we are. Instead, we understand our complex psychological apparatus in terms of underlying complex physical apparatus, the brain and nervous system. All right, so that breakthrough had to occur before psychology was in a position to say, okay, maybe we can take on this complicated psychological apparatus and study it scientifically. The other thing that was necessary, the early psychologists are saying, is something that's common to all of the other sciences, and that is a method issue. Right? That there's lots of very complicated phenomena out there, and it takes a while to build up scientific method until it's in a position to take on increasingly complicated phenomena. So it was a long, tedious in some cases, and laborious process of developing the repertoire of tools, analytic techniques, experimental techniques, mathematical techniques, and so forth over the centuries until the scientists are in a position to have a sophisticated enough scientific method to apply to something as complicated as human psychology. So the argument here is that scientific method was a long time in the developing, but by the time we get to the 19th century, particularly the latter part of the scientific method, 19th century rather, the tools that the scientists have developed methodologically are sophisticated enough that psychology can take its place among the sciences here. Now, to break this down a little further, if we are now going to study the human mind, the human psyche, scientifically. What exactly does that mean? Well, and this is where the behaviorists have their particularly ruthless account of what scientific method consists in. We'll single out two important features. We have to be committed in the first place to observation. Right? Observational data have to be the foundation and the touchstone for all of the conclusions, all of the inferences, all of the theoretical and hypothetical models that we are going to come up with. That if we're not ruthlessly committed to making observational data, whether initial observational data we get just from looking at things, or observational data that we acquire through doing rigorous experimentation, if we're not actually committed to that, if we're not willing to put our hypotheses and theories to the observational test, then we're not really being scientific, and that will have important implications a little bit later. The other thing that scientists then do is, with all of the things that they observe, they are trying to establish correlations. And what we will do is try to say, of these things that we are observing in the world, some of them are causes and some of them are effects. In some cases, of course, there are compound effects. So here's a given effect. Here are all of the causal things that we have observed that made that possible. And of course, the complexity can go the other way. From a given causal set of circumstances, there can be manifold effects. But what we need to do is establish in a scientific, law-like, regularized way connections between cause and effect. And these are things that we sometimes call scientific laws, right, or scientific principles. But I'll just put it for simplicity here. We're trying to correlate cause and effect. Establish regularized correlations among all of the observed phenomena. And those are the two primary components of scientific method.